have Professor Jon Silver, who's an urban geographer interested in the uneven ways in which infrastructure has come to be planned, operationalised and experienced, working across a range of cities in global norths and souths. I think one of his key contributions really has been a post-colonial mode of theorising. These networks paying attention to the ways in which finance, urban politics, everyday interactions and visions of futurity come to shape the infrastructural terrain. And as I said, he's been leading one of our European Research Council projects, GlobalCORRIDOR, which is looking at the role of new infrastructure corridors in shaping urbanisation processes and inequalities in a series of global regions. We also have Dr. Linda Westman, who is currently PI of another of our European Research Council projects, Pluralize, a 5-year project exploring just transitions in urban China. Pluralize brings together philosophical principles, historical analysis, contemporary policy and foreign investment flows to explore just transitions in and beyond China. And prior to this role, Linda worked as a researcher on a number of projects, including our first actually, ERC, LOACT, which was led by Vanessa, and the GATE project at the University of Waterloo. And then, squashed in the middle, we have Dr. Zhengli Huang, who's a research associate at the Urban Institute and has previously worked as a postdoc researcher at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, University of Sheffield. You can see the boomerang urbanism thing is really true. And as an Urban Studies Foundation International Fellow, also here at Sheffield. And her research focuses on Chinese investment in infrastructure across Africa, having worked and lived in Kenya and with fieldwork experience extending across Ethiopia, Uganda, Zambia and Mozambique. And Zhengli has the unenviable position of being squashed between both of her current bosses and former bosses because she's working on both of these ERC projects. Last but not least, the panel is being hosted by Tom Goodfellow. For now, Tom Goodfellow is a Professor of Urban Studies and International Development in the School of Geography and Planning at the University of Sheffield. His research focuses on the political economy of urban development and change in Africa, particularly the politics of urban land and transportation, conflicts around infrastructure and housing, and urban institutional change. And he's project lead of TrueCit, a project examining urban citizenship between the UK and Somali Peninsula, and is seconded to the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office as a senior research fellow. And as many of you know, and if you don't by now, you're not listening to us waffling on long enough, he co-hosts the Urban Radar podcast series with me. Speaking of which, in a special treat today, this panel will be live recorded for Urban Radar and will be our 10th feature released in November. We launched Urban Radar in January this year and have listeners now, or at least one, as Tom keeps reminding me, in each of these places, in 77 countries and 564 cities worldwide.
So with this panel, we're staying broadly on the theme of infrastructure, which obviously Simon and others were talking about earlier, but really looking at quite a different scale and quite different processes. So while the earlier keynote and discussion was kind of about the fragmentation of infrastructure and infrastructure kind of nodes even within the home and domestic space, we're kind of now looking at this idea of the global infrastructure race. Because in addition to all of those dynamics that Simon was talking about, we also know that billions of dollars of investment are flowing into global infrastructure projects across the planet, and these are having really profound effects on cities and regions, with very different, very diverse, very unpredictable effects on urban dwellers in different places. So a lot of the discussion about this, and we will be focusing to some extent on this today, has been about China, the role of China as a leading force in this global infrastructure race, including through the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's very interesting to be reflecting on the projects here because of how much the world has actually changed in the last few years, including since the project started, because while China remains an extremely important actor, it also feels increasingly problematic to just center China in the discussion. So that's why in the title you've seen we're centering and decentering China. We're going to be exploring and interrogating the role of China in this infrastructure race, but also thinking about how the focus on this single country could be problematic. It could essentialize and orientalize China on the one hand, but also miss some other things that are happening or some of the broader processes we need to be concerned with. And importantly, how those land in cities in different parts of the world. So I'm going to begin by turning to Jon, who's leading this Global Urban Corridor project funded by the European Research Council, to ask what exactly is this global infrastructure race? What's happening? Who's involved? How might you characterize this idea of an infrastructure race?
Thanks, Tom. Roll up, it's the great global infrastructure race. So since 2008 economic crisis, I think one of the things we've seen in the global economy is a massive surge of finance and capital into all different kinds of global infrastructure. So here I'm talking about connectivity, infrastructures, highways, ports, train lines, as well as manufacturing nodes such as special economic zones, real estate enclaves along real estate frontiers. And we're seeing all kinds of investors, speculators, agencies, national, regional bodies, and just about every other authority involved in this race. In the Global Corridor project, we've been particularly interested in how these individual global infrastructure projects become bundled together in transnational and multimodal initiatives that we call corridors. And we've documented at least 70 of these infrastructure corridors across the planet, with many more within national jurisdictions, and each month seems to be more and more being proposed. And I think it's quite clear that the logics of the global infrastructure race, as seen from the perspective of the corridor, encompasses a clear focus on national and regional economic development. And I think this is important because this is investment that seems to be going in instead of social programs such as education and health and the development paradigm of the 90s and 2000s. And I'm increasingly convinced that in the 2020s, the state is attempting to derive its authority and legitimacy through its capacity to deliver these mega projects at speed and scale, and as a catch-all solution to issues of poverty, economic stagnation, austerity, growth demands, and other kinds of government imperatives. So this is perhaps also a noticeable shift by states from Egypt to Greece, from the UK to Kenya, away from the role of the state as a redistributive mechanism around social welfare towards demonstrations of enhancing logistical, connectivity and manufacturing capacities through this global infrastructure. Why is it a race? Well, not every port can be the primary export node for a region. Not every special economic zone can attract high-value production. Not every high-speed railway line can secure funding or become the main cargo route, given this kind of dense, often overlapping and sometimes competitive projection of different schemes. And there's all kind of financial risks at play here. Loans go wrong, contracts don't come to fruition, the wrong kind of technical expertise or standards are deployed, there's a failure to stimulate the economic goals such as advanced manufacturing or export-driven economies, labour disputes, all kinds of different kind of financial pressures brought onto already weak fiscal states, the disposal of public assets at future detriment to society. So the race is a race in the sense that there's those that are going to win and benefit financially, and there's others who are left with the burden of the economic costs falling on their shoulders. So as well as this kind of economic reading, there's a more geopolitical reading at play here with the race. All kinds of global factors are determining how global infrastructure projects are being planned and constructed under the conditions of this race, the competing visions of logistical, territorial futures that are often playing out with multiple geo-economic and geopolitical actors, diplomatic games about who owns which port, mine or railway, the connections to militarization, imperialism, and securitization by all different kinds of powers. So perhaps we should start with China, or what C.K. Lee's called the spectre of global China. This is important given the ways in which scholars attribute the kind of acceleration of this global infrastructure race as finding its genesis in the surge of investment that spilled out through the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, initially through its 6 key corridors, but now encompassing dozens of national territories, the polar regions, and even outer space. So the China-Pakistan economic corridor is a really good example of how this BRI has spilled out. China and Pakistan, seen as the oldest of friends in the region, shaped a high-level diplomatic attempt from 2015 onwards to create the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Agreement was signed in 2015 for 51 projects with a total value of 46 billion, which really signals Pakistan's kind of attempt to reposition itself within South Asia and the broader global economy. And here we see all kinds of projects, from the new port at Gwadar, which is positioned as the new Dubai, through to the widening of the Karakoram Highway back across to China, new kinds of power and energy generation facilities, and then following on from that, a kind of manufacturing and real estate developments. So CPEC's a strategic hedge for China. It gives it access to the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. For Pakistan, it allows its powerful friend China to become more deeply integrated in the economy. And I think this integration of China into national economies is being witnessed all over the planet in different kinds of regions. So we can look to the work of Francesca Governor in the Adriatic, a very different region than Pakistan, and draw a kind of clear and sharp findings that Chinese finance into these global infrastructure projects is increasingly integrating and attempting to transform these logistical territories. This hasn't, of course, come without response, particularly from the global hegemon. The US is framed by some scholars, such as DiCarlo and Schindler, within the logics of a rising Second Cold War and attempts at claiming a network centrality over these logistical and technical networks, in which the global infrastructure project acts to bring together both territorial and economic advantages. So this Second Cold War is spilling out in lots of different places. We could think about the Lobito Corridor and the US investment, first under Biden, but surprisingly continuing under Trump, in which US interests in securing secure rare earth materials in the Zambian copper belt and the southern parts of the DRC is a direct kind of infrastructural response to a long-standing Tazara Chinese-funded operated railway in Zambia. Another example might be the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, IMEC, designed to challenge the primacy of the BRI and find new connections between Europe and South Asia and the Middle East. And again, with attempts to reshape the regional architecture of the Middle East even more toward US control and concurrently normalization with Israel. So these corridors are geopolitical. They are being various forms of competition, and they serve various kinds of geopolitical purposes. Alongside Yanis and Seth, we've been looking at how the logistical territories of Greece have become an intense site of competition, most notably out of the Chinese COSCO takeover of the Piraeus port and US responses to that, but with other kinds of actors involved as well. So Russia and the EU figure prominently in that territorial restructuring. There are, and I'm going to list a few, all kinds of supranational actors busy solidifying their own visions of the economic circuits of the planet. For instance, the European Union over the last 20 years has been busy with its own network, 10T, but increasingly is looking further afield and expanding beyond Europe. So the still proposed Trans-Maghreb multimodal corridor uses the same logics as the 10T in Europe, but extends it across the Mediterranean. Regional partnerships that coalesce around corridor plans create new kinds of authorities and bodies. So we can see the Central Asian CAREC initiative that's moved through various phases, both economically, infrastructurally, but also politically. So it's moved from a kind of post-Soviet focus on integration into the economic orbit of Europe through EU reconstruction funding to more recent investments now spilling from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that aims to boost Central Asia as a critical crossroads in global trade, but also bind it more towards China. We have the rising power of Gulf states such as Saudi and the UAE. I was recently in Egypt with colleagues at the American University in Cairo, not long after Abu Dhabi had concluded a $35 billion land deal with the Egyptian government along the Mediterranean coast. So in many contexts, we see how the Gulf is a major investor in global infrastructure projects, along with expected geopolitical influence. And the work of scholars such as Adnan Hania and others at Exeter University are really useful and give a convincing case that this global infrastructure race shouldn't just be seen as either Chinese or a kind of second Cold War between China and the US. I think it's also worth talking a little about newly assertive majority world states, thinking about a lot of countries in Africa that have been punished through decades of structural adjustment, finding new fiscal resources and capacity through new flows of national finance, increased tax bases, and new forms of multilateral assistance, such as the African Development Bank. And I think this is really interesting to think about this moment in which countries such as Uganda, where I've been working, have the capacity to invest from a growing tax base and this access to new forms of finance to follow what Miguel and others have called a kind of infrastructure-led development model that necessitates this real focus and function on global infrastructure. The reverse is true in much of the minority world, with years of austerity in places such as the UK and Greece, meaning that the role of national governments here is not to mobilise national funds, but increasingly is an enabler for finance from places like China or the Gulf to facilitate investment and to try and reconfigure these austerity-hit national states to keep up in the global infrastructure race. Finally, I just want to talk about the range of financial actors that are involved in the race, thinking about private equity, pensions, sovereign wealth funds, high wealth individuals that are increasingly drawn to the sector of global infrastructure as a stable and long-term asset. You can pick up the Financial Times and see all kinds of figures being mooted. I think this morning I checked, apparently the global infrastructure market is worth 3 trillion over the next 3 years, but it could be 10 trillion over 3 years. No one really knows, but what we do see is how these finance actors have increasingly seen the financialization of infrastructure and control moving from nation states to these actors. So this is a dizzying set of geoeconomic and geopolitical processes unfolding in and around the organizing logic of global infrastructure. But also, that's why I think we should call it a race, because there's so many different kinds of objectives, aims, motivations at work in what's going on.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. I'm just going to hand over to Linda now for some more thoughts. Yeah.
Passing it back and forth. Cute. Just a quick comment on these narratives on global China and the rise of China, which are becoming increasingly popular because of this global infrastructure race. I would suggest that they are permeated by an imaginary of China as a kind of other, which in turn is something that builds on a long tradition of orientalizing thought. A way of portraying China as a kind of alternative to Western society, something that is implicit in ideas like thought traditions of the West and East, actually. But in contemporary use, we also see it quite often as in reference to China as a kind of alternative source of geopolitical power, something that we originally saw in international relations theory, but now in a much broader scholarship and even in the news. I would suggest that these are narratives that tend to produce very stereotypical and dichotomic representations of China. They're fixed in ideas of China as some kind of mirror image, or even just simply as a threat to the West. It is not something that allows us to understand particular anything about China, not politics within China, not how various groups are mobilizing interests in relation to specific stakeholders or against them or anything like that. And I think that that is also specifically something that we want to continue to unpack, well, through our research, but also through this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to come back, I think, to that question of kind of China not being a monolith and how it breaks down in specific places and cities as we start to think more about the urban impacts and implications of this race. So how do we understand, I mean, this is another big question, but the impacts on cities particularly, as most of us here are interested in cities and urban areas, what are the impacts on cities of these huge investments and how they land on the ground in the parts of the world where you're doing research?
Great, I'll take that. I mean, I think firstly, without opening a can of worms, it's worth thinking more about the urban rather than cities per se, in relation to these global infrastructure projects, given that they just encompass such massive territories and indeed reconfigure how we think about the city and the urban region. I still think we're looking for the right vocabulary to describe and analyse the ways in which global infrastructure touches down in urban space. They don't seem to fully correspond with some of the concepts currently at our disposal, even whilst they all offer certain inroads into thinking about urban conditions under these kind of logics, or what the team in Sheffield have called corridorization as a kind of logic of reshaping and transforming urban spaces. I mean, this task is inherently comparative and built through dialogue, extending in lots of different kinds of ways, given the scale and the speed of these transformations. So I'm going to focus the answer to the question, I think, less on urban governance and more at this stage on thinking through everyday lives and the ways in which these massive projects cause all kinds of different upheavals. And these are injustices that are often invisibilized by the state under the promises of future economic development, shared prosperity, through infrastructure investment. And I think we need to really foreground the ways in which cities become the sites of many different kinds of global infrastructure project rollout, but also small towns, villages, places along the way in hinterlands, and those less studied places. So let's think about a large global infrastructure project hitting a town or a city. Is households and communities on the sharp end of these transformations that might be a particularly interesting site to look at. So in the Global Corridor project, we've been working with the Karachi Urban Lab. Tawheed Mohammed has been leading research, which will be, here's a plug, featured in a forthcoming report we'll be releasing, trying to model through GIS means potential displacements along the rehabilitated Mainline 1 railway. So this is the national railway through Pakistan, $6.8 billion, but could be more. Partnership deal has been arranged with Exim Bank in China, and the promise is to increase the acceleration of logistics, goods, cargo from northern Pakistan and into China, through speed and capacity. So this is great. This is great for the Pakistan national economy. This is great for its kind of placing within logistical competition. But when you get down to the ground of cities such as Karachi and Lahore, you realize that the rehabilitation of the railway involves massive displacement. And what Tawheed has done is take two distances that might be used for expanding the railway, 25 metres and 40 metres, and gone and modelled the whole railway route, gone on the ground and kind of modelled what kind of numbers are going to be displaced if this railway project goes ahead. And there's some very interesting differentiation in affected households between 25 metre standard and a 40 metre standard, tens of thousands of households different. So this is what happens when a global infrastructure project rolls out on the ground, when it rolls out and lands and materialises in the city. In work with the British Institute of East Africa, Waru Mugathimi focuses on the expulsion of 40,000 people along the Nairobi Expressway, particularly focused in the neighbourhood of Makoro. Again, this is a Chinese-financed toll road with a Chinese private operator. The question is, does China matter here? Is it something more than a financer or a funder? But if you go to Makoro, even years later, you can kind of see the devastation. It almost looks like a bomb went off in some places. And I use that kind of term because I think that a lot of these projects are world-shattering for many communities. You can see the kind of ways in which whole lives disappear beneath project logics. So I've termed this kind of lived experience of global infrastructure as a corridor urbanism, drawing attention to injustice, struggle, contestation at the urban scale, but also kind of building on the work of Malik, thinking more about some of the mundane inhabitations along these spaces that can never really be reduced to the capitalist logics which they seek. So here people open up livelihoods, might be repairing long-distance lorries at a village stop, opportunities, new kinds of urban relations that are often stretched. And I think this also requires more attention when we think about how global infrastructure projects land in cities. I've been undertaking research in eastern Uganda in the town of Mbale for quite some time. It's both peripheral in the world and perhaps even the regional economy, even though I think it's very important. But it's also critical to the operations of the Northern Corridor, which stretches from the port of Mombasa into the East African hinterlands. And recently, Mbale's been the site of quite a few new global infrastructure project investments, including the rehabilitation of the old colonial railway up to Gulu in the north of the country, and the establishment of a special economic zone, which is probably the most advanced in the country. It's called the Sino-Uganda Mbale Industrial Park. It's a partnership between the Uganda Investment Authority and a private Chinese company with little or no state-to-state investment in it. And like many other cases that we've looked at in the project across different towns and cities, it's reliant on the securitization of the land. So like all these big infrastructure projects, they're fenced off, they're securitized, they have advanced forms of surveillance. People that inhabited that land beforehand are evicted. In the case of Mbale, this is violent eviction for some, shattered lives and communities living in the wake of this logistical restructuring. But we also see these same households that are displaced are now working in the factories in the zone. They're finding a new toehold, however small, in a new place to live outside of the securitized zone, a space that now operates on top of what were once their spaces of dwelling. So it's really important to think about both injustice and inequality in the way in which these projects land in towns and cities, but also the kind of forms of I'm not even going to say it, of everyday life. Because there's something interesting at play here, right? You go into the zone, there's new Chinese capitalists and technicians sitting at the restaurant at the end of the day after they've kind of realized a new kind of operation. There's visiting dignitaries from town, tasting Chinese food perhaps for the first time, or using chopsticks while securing some kind of new contracting agreement with factory managers that provides other forms of employment in the town. There's municipal staff negotiating with park authorities about environmental regulations that have been ignored, but they're trying to piece something back together after this kind of massive event. So the industrial park in Mbale is a really kind of pertinent example of how these projects land in place in towns and cities. And I think also show how global China is a variegated presence, involving all kinds of different actors, drivers, financial arrangements, local organizational fixes, and such like. So alongside the very specific roles of national and local actors, which we also have to pay attention to when thinking about this kind of landing, and then other kinds of lives that inhabit the spaces around them. So I think this kind of broad assumptions about China's role in the global infrastructure race are correct if they're a bit flat, i.e., you know, the BRI is a spatial fix for overaccumulation in China, and or it's a grand geopolitical strategy that seeks to reposition China amongst global affairs. But what grounded research does that we've conducted and on this panel and also in this room is show a kind of spectrum of ways in which we can unpack the lived experience of global infrastructure and really think what it means when this is Chinese investment.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Jon. And as we said, we're going to be centering and decentering China in this discussion. So we'll do some more decentering later, but we're now going to go deep into what it actually means to talk about Chinese investment and China's role. This has been alluded to, but I'm going to turn now to Zhengli. So Zhengli and I have actually worked together as well on a project looking at some of these things in Uganda again and in Ethiopia around urban infrastructure projects, and Zhengli's done a lot of very interesting work recently also in Kenya. So based on these and your other experiences, if you could tell us a bit more about how we can unpack this idea of Chinese infrastructure investment and what are the drivers behind it at all these different levels.
Thank you, Tom. I want to start by saying that it's actually very important to break down the idea of a grand strategy or terms like global China into different stakeholders. It's important because the thoughts of, or the narratives of grand strategies, well, they're helpful in explaining some of the things, for example, the surge of infrastructure finance into developing regions like Africa from China since the 2008 and financial crisis. But it doesn't really explain other things. For example, there's actually a lack of cohesive action plan, for example, to build connected networks of infrastructure in certain regions by Chinese stakeholders. It doesn't also explain, for example, the fierce competition among Chinese companies in these infrastructure construction sectors in Africa. So when we start to unpack, the stakeholders will see that it's actually not a monolithic thing. It's made up of a myriad of different stakeholders, and first and foremost is the state-owned enterprises as contractors. Now, these are big-scale construction companies that is technically owned by the state, but they are very diverse in the sense that they are hundreds in number in the domestic market in China, and in each of the countries that I visited, including Kenya, in Ethiopia, there are at least 60 or 70 companies are competing for similar projects across the country. You can imagine how diverse and how confusing then it looks from outside. And these are, not to mention these companies are with very confusing names. Some are called CR, China Railway Engineering Corporation, and China Railway Corporation are actually two, number 13 and number 17. They're actually very different companies with very different managerial styles and investment styles and scales of investment. And then behind these, or beyond those state-owned enterprises, there are also the powerful policy banks from China, including the Exim Bank and the China Development Bank, who are arguably behind some of, well, major, huge infrastructure projects in Africa and across the globe. But we have to also understand that these banks are unlike the multilateral financial institutes or a lot of Exim banks from OECD countries. They don't have local branches. At maximum, they have probably a regional representative office with 2 or 3 staff. So they don't actually take part in the daily operation of the infrastructure projects or decision-making of these infrastructure projects that they investing in. So the information that they got are from the people mostly from the local partners and also the state-owned enterprises who are building these projects. So between the SOEs and the policy banks, there's a very interesting interplay. This is a very unique feature of what we call global China today. The interests or the speculative actions of these SOEs are driving the development of some of the biggest infrastructure projects in Africa. And they would then, aiming at certain projects, they would start to bring the finance back up on board, which means that they would bring, later on, they would bring the Exim Bank and the state banks on board in negotiation with the hosting countries to facilitate the realization of such projects. So basically what we are seeing, and this has been a common pattern in China finance, the huge infrastructure projects in Africa, is that this commercial interests or speculative actions by these state-owned enterprises are driving the implementation of such projects. So it's actually not a grand strategy, it's driven by commercial interests. And beyond this interplay between the state actors, there are also a myriad of private enterprises, just as the one who is managing the industrial park in Bale, for example, as Jon just mentioned. And these are much smaller in scale, but much more in number, in quantity. So they're much harder to predict what kind of investment that they're interested in. And last but not the least, it's very important to note the contextual background in which these infrastructural projects are being implemented. It is precisely the states in Africa, and sometimes most cases the elites, that have planned these infrastructure projects that paved the ground for or attracted the Chinese investment into these projects. And for example, the Kenyan standard gauge railway, which is part of the Northern Corridor, as Jon just mentioned, it's first planned by African planners, East African planners, in one of the summits in East Africa at the beginning of the century. And it was the Kenyan politician who approached the Chinese company, which is in this case China Road and Bridge. They started the negotiation. They wanted to engage the Chinese company to start the project as a PPP. And it was the Chinese company who had the idea of bringing in the Exim Bank on board in this project that kickstart the project negotiation and the signing of the bilateral agreement between the two states in 2010, which predates the coining of the term BRI, which took place in a tour. I think President Xi Jinping went into Kazakhstan and coined the term Belt and Road Initiative in 2014. So it actually, if you read today about standard gauge railway from Kenya, it's frequently used as a flagship project of BRI, but actually it was the speculative actions of these stakeholders that predates the grand narrative.
Okay, thank you. That's such a really useful and interesting historical background. I just want to ask you, though, because this kind of landscape of actors you're talking about, state-owned enterprises, these development banks, some private companies, presumably that's what's happening with many other countries as well, who are operating in places like Africa or around the world, investing overseas. As you say, people often think it's all about this grand plan and it's all about state-owned companies, and we know almost all the industrial parks we looked at were run by these private business people who were just looking for a new opportunity. So how is it different? How is what these Chinese actors do different from what other global actors might be doing, if at all?
Yeah, I agree. I think from that sense, if you look from capitalism point of view per se, I don't think Chinese investment is very different from any other variety of capitals. I guess unless you start to unpack global China from within, you start to realize that what's unique about Chinese investment is this very unique dynamic between the stakeholders that's owned by the state and the market, or the diverse private or semi-private, semi-state stakeholders. So it is precisely this dynamic relations between the state and the market, and sometimes it's termed as state capital nexus or state firm nexus, that determines that the Chinese investment will take very different forms under different contexts. For example, I think it will take very different forms in the context of the global north in comparison to Africa, which reminds me of something that Jon has done recently on Manchester.
Yeah, I mean, the question, if Chinese capital goes global, how is it able to land, is really important. And in work with Adam and Rich on the Centripetal project, we've asked that question in the Global North in Manchester. And I think there's two areas of analysis that we've proceeded through. First, how and in what form, whether developer, financer, intermediary, constructor, does Global China go global in these Western urban spaces? And then second, what are the local conditions that Zhengli talks about that facilitate the landing of this state capital? Right, it's not some force that just lands without there being a lot of work. So you can look at a city like Manchester, where there is the promise of billions of Chinese investment over the last decade. A lot of that is boosterist and doesn't actually come forward if you do the analysis. But what we did find was a multiple set of different actors, investment sites, and perhaps most interestingly, partnerships and organizational forms and fixes that enable the landing of this Chinese capital. And I think focusing on the partnership or the organizational form or fix is really interesting. So you can see in the Airport City deal how two parties involved. One is the airport group itself, made up of local municipalities, the local state, and an Australian private asset manager firm, IFM, with a state-owned enterprise, Beijing Construction Engineering Group. So this has had to take on a very particular organisational form and fix within the UK context of financing, of kind of project management and project development. And although this was heralded as a £1 billion deal, there's not really been much work there. There's been a few hotels and half a business park, and a bridge. But what BCGI was able to do was establish itself through this partnership. It gave it the legitimacy to strike deals with other municipalities, Bolton and Wigan, in the region, to develop surrounding sites in these surrounding municipalities. And this kind of increased its local legitimacy, it enhanced its operations. And now what you find is BCG operates on a kind of purely commercial logic of construction tenders and winning them. So the form of BCGI changes over time. In Manchester, there's another partnership between the local state and a high wealth Hong Kong real estate family. It's encompassing 15,000 new homes. It's supposed to be one of the new towns that the government have been celebrating in the last week or two. And I often ask the question, how did a wealthy Hong Kong family, previously known for high-end condos, casinos and car parks in Hong Kong and Australia, acquire a deal that is going to give them tens of millions of public land transfer support and different kinds of preparation by the local state to allow that capital to land? I mean, there's all kinds of different organizational forms and fixes. You have more silent capital from China that just finances ongoing urban development. So Middlewood Locks is a really good example. You also have what we call the petit rentier, so small-scale middle-class families in Hong Kong and somewhat in China, buying one or two houses or housing units in Manchester, and that's thousands of units per year. So what is Global China at this point, and how do we make sense of it? And I think focusing on the forms and the partnerships is really important. We find these are highly variegated modes of operation for Global China to proceed. It highlights the role of the local, or as you've mentioned, the national state, in the making of investable terrains for Chinese finance. And this spans a whole host of different kind of de-risking strategies, which I think you could talk about more, right, given your work there.
Yeah, I do want to turn back to you, Zhengli, and I also want to, because I think this is an important question to reflect on. We've got a sense of Global China now, and in a minute we'll talk a little bit about the changing investment priorities of the government globally. But how do we think about the fact that this communist, relatively poor, kind of autarkic country that was mainly concerned with its own industrialization just a few decades ago, is now in a position to be this major provider of housing in Manchester, among other parts of the world. Can you give us a little bit, briefly, of that historical background that allowed this to happen?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think it's very critical that we trace this phenomenon of global China back for decades. And I think this is in relation to what we were just talking about, the differences between the Global South, what they are doing in Global South and Global North. For example, the Kenyan SGR, again, using this as an example, there's an underlying assumption that this is going to be a developmental project because there's an underlying logic of using urbanization as a boost of economy. And this thought is deeply rooted. I want to trace back 30 years, at least in the middle of 1990s, the financial reform, which paved the way for an urban economic model that was dominant in China in the past 30 years. So what happened in 1990s was a financial reform which basically redistributed the revenue income between the central government and the local government. What was born at the same time was the policy banks, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, Exim Bank and China Development Banks. And then out of that, what happened was a loop was generated between the central financial institutions and the local state, represented by something that we call local financial platform, which the local government is using the land as a collateral to borrow money from the central banks in order to boost economy into the infrastructure sector, to draw private investors into new areas, especially at the fringe of urban areas. Now, this logic is built on a booming economy based on real estate, basically. And this, since the 1990s, has replaced industrialization to become the territorial logic of accumulation of wealth in China, and it lasted for at least 30 years. And so what we are seeing today, the investment by these policy banks and the construction sector boom that benefited from this 30 years of nonstop economic growth in China, that they basically were going outward, and it was basically an externalization of this what we term as urban statecraft by China, which is using urbanization as a territorial logic to boost the accumulation of capital in China. And this is very important because now we're seeing a shift in trend, because partly because the money in the central banks are drying out, but also because now we're seeing, as the economic downturn is taking place in China, we're seeing that this bubble is collapsing, basically. So we're looking, I think there's a dire need of developing alternatives of economic growth in China and also outward finance. So what we are seeing in Africa, going back to Africa, what we are seeing is that there's the SOEs, for example, they're shifting from using the loans as a financial backup to more becoming a private partner, as exemplified, for example, in Nairobi Expressway. The same contractor who built the standard gauge railway actually became a financial partner of the expressway. So these are the things that we're seeing more and more today.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. So we have this sense in which the kind of Chinese form of urban statecraft has an urbanization-driven economy, has in a sense been exported with actors going out and basically using urbanization elsewhere as a form of development and profit making. But we also see this hugely changing global landscape, including, the financial crisis and its effects, and a downturn in the Chinese economy relatively. But there's also changing policy priorities globally. So how have these things led to shifts just in the last kind of decade or so over what the Chinese government and other actors seek to do with their investments? Linda.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to backtrack first and continue to build on what Zhengli was saying, because we're academics and we were obsessed with tracing backwards before then going to answer your actual question. So yeah, to continue on what Zhengli was saying about this logic of pursuing economic growth through capital accumulation in urban areas, this is something that we can trace even further back in China's history to the very, very earliest days of the communist regime, when the appropriation of land by the state enabled a kind of low-cost investment into industrial expansion primarily in those days, which contributed to the economic development that was so essential at that time, and that has then contributed over the past decades and formalized into a model that has continued to spur economic growth, as Zhengli was saying. And if you look at the decades following the opening up and reform programs that were adopted at the end of the 1970s, China has witnessed among the most rapid and large-scale processes of urbanization that any country has ever seen. And again, as Zhengli explained, this urbanization has become intermingled with economic development in a way that is now inseparable in many ways from this like so-called growth miracle that China has achieved. And that the party itself likes to describe as lifting millions out of poverty and a success story in all of this. So it is understandable that urbanization actually has become an economic development objective in and of itself. It has been integrated into the 5-year plans, which are the documents that formulate the development visions of the country. Since the 11th 5-year plan, urbanization was explicitly adopted as a strategic objective to realize economic growth. So completely embedded into the growth model, and often narrated as a success story, even a template of success. So we have that on the one hand, but then what we have on the other hand is that, of course, this tremendous process of socioeconomic and ecological transformation has created massive challenges as well, of course. And the most evident one would be the ever-growing divides between the more urbanized and the less urbanized parts of China, which are most evident if we look at the western and the eastern regions. And of course, then also all of the development challenges that urbanization has been causing in all the other parts of the world, like continued demand on natural resources, air pollution, this kind of things, which become much more vast when the cities are much more vast as they are in China. So to return back to your question, what we have seen in the more recent decades is a shift to something that the political leadership likes to call new urbanization, which places the emphasis on the quality rather than the quantity, let's say the speed or the scale of urbanization. And we're also seeing the uptake of a long list of buzzwords that we're now familiar with from urban sustainability discourse everywhere, basically, like smart and integrated and people-centered and resource-efficient forms of development. So narratives of environmental protection are kind of creeping into these narratives or discourses or practices of both urban planning and economic planning. And to return back again to your question, we are also seeing that this is creating a new form of investment imperative. It includes support of tactical industries like new materials and batteries and the green and the blue economy and circularity and things like that. And also, of course, massive amounts of funding that is channeled towards new kinds of infrastructure systems and also technologies like transport systems or waste management or smart and digital platform in the Simon Marbian sort of way. Renewable energy, of course, also. China now being the largest producer and consumer of renewable energy on a global level. It has also become tactical for China to frame this as part of some sort of impressive climate change strategy, which at the same time allows Xi Jinping to brand itself as the hero, the global savior of the climate change problem. Leadership in electronic vehicles is a very good example of this, where China is now the global leader both in production and sales, is creating all kinds of tactical markets, feeding seamlessly into these narratives of China as a hero and a global responsible superpower, while at the same time, if we look at how this is actually playing out in China, yes, we see that there's an uptake of new infrastructure and technologies, but with EVs that are actually being powered by coal plants, so a lot more ambiguous about the real climate mitigation happening there.
On that point about environmental damage of some of the Chinese projects overseas, I know you've been doing work on the mining sector and looking at this in various African countries, including the Congo. I'm not sure if either of you want to say a bit more about that.
I will say a bit more about how the environmental governance logic is or is not traveling, and we can leave to Zhengli if we've actually not started to do research on that yet. We've just done the preliminary assessment of the database, but let's see if you want to say anything about that. But overall, I think it is very tempting to assume that the environmental governance models in China may be traveling elsewhere, like with the growth of soft power and things like that. And this is something that is also documented and debated in the scholarship on the diffusion of environmental authoritarianism and things like this. I would say that we have to be very, very cautious about this because no country, including or even maybe especially China, is able to export its states, single-party states, somewhere else. And I think this is what Zhengli's idea about the externalization of statecraft is showing so effectively, how certain relationships, of course, can travel somewhere else, certain investment rationales, but never full-fledged export of all the complex relationships that make up a state. What we do have is research on single cases where we can often find things like limited amounts of transparency or limited amount of involvement of local stakeholders, which is hinting towards a corporate culture that is different from what we're now accustomed to in terms of international projects. And that, of course, can also inspire debates about what will the future of the international regimes be, given that they are, in fact, fixed in liberal democratic norms that don't necessarily match the many political traditions in China, but this is an open question. China's leadership also, of course, wants to brand its foreign investment projects as green, and there's even a green vision for the BRI. But if we look into where the majority of state funding is actually going, it continues to be directed towards conventional energy projects. The analysis that Zhengli has been doing in the Pluralize project looks at the A-data database, which is basically documenting bilateral funding in form of loans and grants. And here we can see that the largest amount of funding is being directed to countries with significant fossil fuel resources. Angola at the top of the list, Venezuela, Central Asia, even Russia. So coal, oil, and gas continue to be the target sectors. And even though it might not be that the investment is going towards the actual extraction of fossil fuel resources, that's actually usually not the case. It is directed towards the surrounding infrastructure, so transmission grids, pipelines, and exactly like Jon and Zhengli have been saying, into the ports, the railroads, the roads that produce connectivity with this. We can look forward to some amazing rhetorical moves from the Chinese leadership to still promote these as green, like tactics like clean coal or super extra efficient thermal plants, this kind of thing, which we're accustomed with from within China. To be fair, other governments do that too. I think we can question how green anything is in the context of an extractivist global capitalist economy, but yes.
Okay, thank you. So now we've broken apart China in the sense that we know this is by no means a unitary actor. The combination of actors involved is shifting over time significantly, and it doesn't always do the things it says it's doing. But in a final segment here, let's try and actually decentre it altogether, because we have obviously mainly focused on China for good reason, and I think that's come through clearly. But what are some of the risks of this? I mean, what is it really about China, this infrastructure race? What do we miss by focusing too much on China? Back to you, Jon.
Great. So let's centre and decentre. I think I added the decentering because I'm not a China expert. But I think nobody is. But I think, the narrative of the global infrastructure race, the Second Cold War, the security issues around the Belt and Road Initiative, the fear of the Chinese debt trap, the influence of China government on urban and national scale projects. These are actually all the kind of issues that you could be thinking about in relation to the US. They're kind of the same issues that we should be paying attention to with rising powers, such as the Gulf Cooperation Council. And I think one thing that scholarship has done right with global China is to bring some of these issues to the fore. So I think the question is how we can take the understandings and the critical attention that has gone into the Belt and Road for 10 years, since its inception, and mobilise that in different ways across different kinds of geopolitical and geoeconomic actors. And I think that both centres and decenters China. It shows that China is the impetus to much of what's going on around global infrastructure, but it also demonstrates that it's just one actor amongst many. Perhaps more importantly, as researchers, is to be responsible in how we think about global China within the role of global infrastructure projects. In the West, including in the UK, there's increasingly a growing climate of hostility and war preparation towards China. And I think how we mobilise our research or how it's mobilised once we've published could be a really important issue going into the future. So let's centre and decentre.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's have a huge round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much.